A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the three key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Wow, Greg, we talked about this might have happened. Overnight, then, it did happen. The biggest American strike package for a long, long time. What was your take on the American strike last night?
Yeah, a massive decision and a massive strike, and not an insignificant amount of effort put in by America. And perhaps slightly strangely, for a stealth attack, it probably was quite well telegraphed, despite the deception plan, and clearly involved a lot more aeroplanes than just the 7 B-2s.
Yeah, the B-2 was particularly interesting because I think, although the US was originally meant to order hundreds of these things, they only actually ordered 21, didn't they? One's been thrashed, one's no longer serviceable. So 7 out of 19 is quite a significant proportion of the fleet. But I understand that they literally, it's a 38-hour trip, round trip. And I seem to remember there was a nagging doubt that how these guys train. They train locked in a simulator for hours and hours on end. Yeah. Do they sleep, or are they drug-induced, kept awake? I remember hearing some stories about this.
Yeah, be careful using drug-induced. I have been in a B-2 cockpit, not in the air, admittedly, and they actually look more like a rather seedy little office than a cockpit. It's almost got something more akin to a desk at the front than a cockpit, even with a keyboard, would you believe, so you can type messages. There is room to sleep. You can put a mattress on the floor and kip and take it in turns. There is even a portaloo for when you're caught short, because as you probably will be after 40 hours. I do think they play some clever tricks with drugs just to keep themselves rested and awake when they need to be awake. So goodness knows what the recovery period is for them after their 40-hour trip. But I used to remember we used to do red flag missions that was a sort of 15, 20-minute transit, whereas these guys would do a 12-hour trip to get there and then a 12 hours to simulate these types of missions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, but given that we want to make this relatively punchy, we'll look away from the B-2 stuff. There are 125 other assets that are involved. All of this seems to be just to get these 14 GBU-57s, these massive ordnance penetrators, onto their target. And there seems to be some irony here, because we're talking about the biggest, most powerful high-tech military air force in the world, basically just delivering 14 massive great bombs. 30,000-pound bombs. It wasn't subtle. It's just literally designed to get as far under the terrain as possible and try and get at those Fordow uranium enrichment sites, wasn't it?
Yeah, and if you draw comparisons, you're almost looking at sort of a tall boy bomb from the 1940s. You know, it's quite crude, really. Yes, they're a sophisticated weapon, but at the end of the day, we're just dropping a massive amount of ordnance on a point on the ground. I think you raise a really important point. We saw a build-up of these other aircraft, so the F-22s, F-35s, F-15s, partly because we thought it was sensible reinforcement of the region, because it could obviously blow up anyway, because Iran might react. What we didn't necessarily appreciate is that they were going to be part of the package that would ultimately get the B-2s into the target area. I think that's been quite interesting for me, because actually the B-2s are perfectly capable of sneaking in on their own, of course, and Israel's done quite a lot of damage to the Iranian air defense system. So how much they were actually needed, we may not know, although I think they've said that nothing actually engaged the package, so that tells you that things were pretty quiet. But it was probably a bit of belt and braces from America, just to make sure they didn't leave anything to test, because if they were going to do a one-pass mission, they wanted to get it right.
Well, as you say, the last thing you'd want is any intelligence, meaning that the Iranians will keep anything back and then open up a salvo against, a strategic asset like the B-2 bomber. But I do recall, there were only throwaway lines from General Kane, but he talked about this sort of protection, high-speed assets, and actually proactively preempting, I think he said, strike.
As the strike package approached Fordow and Natanz, The U.S. protection package employed high-speed suppression weapons to ensure safe passage of the strike package, with fighter assets employing preemptive suppressing fires against any potential Iranian surface-to-air threats. We are currently unaware of any shots fired at the U.S. strike package.
So I presume by that he means anti-radiation missiles, harm, deed and seed missions. That's the sort of thing that you did. Can you give us a flavour for the viewer, just what that mission is all about?
Yeah, if you've got a conventional threat out there that's a peer threat, and Iran isn't really what we would call a peer threat, but it's close. You'd have aircraft in order to defend from air attack, so looking to take out any aeroplanes getting airborne. I'm not sure Iran has got an air force left anymore. And then you'd have what's called a SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defense package, which would target any radars or missile systems that might intercept with the package. And you'd either do that preemptively by bombing them or shooting at them, or you'd sit there waiting for them to emit, and then you'd attack those emissions. There's one other little factor that people may not be aware with. One thing the Americans would be extremely careful of is what would they do if they lost a pilot over, and it could have happened for any reason, engine fire or whatever, is how do you then quickly pick that pilot up, get them out, so that Iran doesn't have some sort of political, coup by having a pilot that they can parade into Iran. And there would have been quite a large part of the package also there for that reason as well.
No, it's a really good shout, isn't it? The Americans are so good at that combat, survival, rescue mission, and it all goes unheard of because inevitably, if you don't need it, you're not going to talk a lot about it at all. But I was struck that we haven't seen any Iranian aircraft over Israeli airspace yet. The Israelis say no Iranian aircraft have gone up to try and challenge the Israelis, so it shouldn't be a great surprise, I suspect, that no Iranian wants to get involved in a fight with an F-22. Operation Certain Death would have entailed. The one thing I'd pick up on, though, is that you and I, delivered a fair few bits of ordnance over our time. And it's one thing delivering a bomb on a target as you planned. It's quite another whether it had the effect that you wanted to have. And these bunker busters, GBO-57s, they go down a long way. I've seen some of the pictures, but how on earth do you know whether the target has indeed, as President Trump says, been obliterated? I mean, it feels to me at the moment, it's almost impossible to tell.
It is the $64 million question. I mean, clearly America, particularly Mr. Trump, has decided to declare victory. But I think there's a lot of questions still to be answered as to whether that actually has been achieved. As you and I know, if we're hitting targets on the surface, you can more often than not see the effect. Certainly within 20, 30 seconds, you can see if the bridge or the tank or whatever you were attacking has been struck. When you're just dropping on a point on the ground that allegedly then leads you to a underground bunker, you're not going to see that from the surface. You're not going to see it from a satellite. We've all seen the satellite images. You can see holes and you can see spoil that's come out of those holes, but you really don't know what's happened underneath, and you don't know if what you were bombing has been moved. So, yeah, there is some risk. Now, some of that you might pick up from signals traffic. You're going to be listening to hear whether people are talking about what's being done or what's being moved, and that may take time to be revealed.
Yeah, because the one thing I was concerned about here was that if the Americans, they've taken a huge risk, both internationally but also nationally, by getting involved in this. It seems to be that President Trump wants to make this a one-off strike. That's it, we're done. But you go, having taken all that risk, if you haven't achieved your objective, you've taken a huge amount of risk for no gain. And it feels to me, therefore, with this untold question, and therefore it leads me down the path of sort of going, I wonder if the objective was actually not the facilities, because frankly they can rebuild those in a year. It's actually the 400 kilograms, of enriched uranium that's up at about 60% now. Those trucks had all appeared outside. Maybe actually what's going on here is that the Americans are flushing out all of that uranium, so that the only place it can go now is somewhere that's probably less secure and therefore would be vulnerable to something else. The only thing that makes sense to me, otherwise why would you just declare victory and stop and start negotiating?
These targets have been known for a long time. They're probably the worst kept secrets in the world. I mean, if it was me, would I be keeping everything in one place, thinking it was safe underground, knowing that these bombs exist, knowing that the Americans can do what they do, or would I hide it somewhere else? Well, I won't give Iran too many clues, but I think you can tell from what I've just said. So, yeah, there's every chance here that Iran can restart. It might take a while, but has this dealt with the problem for a while? I think the trick for Trump was could we do this, yes or no? And military advice would have been yes, but you need 7 aircraft with 2 bombs each equals, and come up with a probability. But politically, of course, he's making 2 gambles. One, has this upset Congress and has it upset his MAGA base? Because he's done something that he said he wouldn't do, i.e. start a war. And the next thing is, what will Iran do? Because if Iran does retaliate and, heaven forbid, causes American casualties, attacks on American bases, heaven forbid on the American mainland, is that blame going to all come back at Trump? And so it's not just a military gamble, this, as to whether they've achieved their aim. There's also a political gamble as to whether this is actually going to upset some of his followers.
So because that's where I was going next with this, is if you're now Iran, you're incredibly vulnerable. You have no protection. You've got Israel striking with impunity. You know, last night they were back in again, the Israelis just plugging away, and it feels that nothing Iran can do about it. Is this really the time that Iran wants to pick a fight with America? You know, I get all the rhetoric, I get all the fiery rhetoric out there, but if they were to do a strike like that, they know that they'd be poking the bear. Goodness knows what would come back at them. I just wonder what Iran's choices are at the moment.
Yeah, totally fair point. You're right. And listening to some of the rhetoric, so Trump saying job done, not coming back. Now let's all shake hands, and Iran saying, well, you haven't touched us. You could argue that's an off ramp. Both sides walk away with honours even, both knowing what they think they know, and things calm down. And then, of course, the question is, does Israel continue or not? So that's a separate issue. Or do Iran look at themselves now and go, we are totally vulnerable, and it's almost like no more harm can be done to us than has already been done. This is our opportunity to maybe push a bit of regime change back the other way and create problems for Netanyahu and create problems for Trump. And Iran don't always play by the rules. In fact, they rarely play by the rules. They will be thinking about all the different options that they can do without, however, having another military attack on them, because they are quite vulnerable now, and they do need to be very careful at what they bring upon themselves.
One of the things that when you talked about America, though, you talked about the 2 things, one of which the MAGA base and, you know, whatever, and Congress. The one thing that I'm also interested in is the impact he's had internationally. If you look at the British government, I've heard a couple of interviews where they've got themselves tied in knots of late. Do you support or not this action? You know, where does this leave the nation? Where does it leave the UK?
Yeah, really tricky. Now, we obviously put reinforcements into theatre, which presumably was Cyprus, was a pragmatic move to reinforce the area in case there were any further attacks or broadening of the conflict, and secondly, to potentially provide assistance to maybe Israel, which we have done in the past to attacks from Iran, taking out drones and cruise missiles. I don't think it was in any way, shape or form a precursor, if you like, to assist an American strike. We've already talked about the fact that our tankers aren't compatible with USAF aircraft, so the B-2s could never have refueled off a British aircraft. So the UK has so far distanced itself from the strike. In fact, they've used those words, but haven't condemned it, but nor have they supported it. And I think that's walking the tightrope between not wanting to be a target of Iran's ire, whilst at the same time perhaps privately saying to America, you know, job well done, but not being able to say that in public. So, yeah, the UK is really caught between a rock and a hard place here, and it is struggling with how to explain that. I think what is critical now is what happens next. If this was a one-off and Iran sits back and goes, OK, you've done your worst, let's see where we go from here, then maybe the UK will be able to sit this one out completely. But if there are strikes in the rest of the Middle East, and heaven forbid against UK bases around that region, then we're in a very, very different place. Like being
Well, Greg, we literally just finished recording the podcast, and it looks like all hell's broken loose in the Middle East. We're just getting reports at the moment. It's all a bit broken, but it looks like Qatari airspace is under fire, as well as a US base across in Iraq. What's your take on this reaction? Because we literally thought that it might be that Iran would sort of pause for a bit before and reconsider what its options were going to be. It does look like it's decided to strike, and quickly.
Yeah, everyone was sitting back hoping they'd take it on the chin, but I think that was probably a bit fanciful, let's be honest. And they've chosen to respond. Now, the response, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is not a household name in the UK. But if you're in the military, particularly if you're in the Air Force, it absolutely is a household name. Many people have spent many months, including myself. You may well have spent a few times there as well. So it's a critical base. Everybody knows it's a critical base, including Iran. So America and the UK obviously did the right thing and have pretty much dispersed anything there that was of any value, or hardened everything else and kept people out of harm's way. In fact, the government advice to all people living in Qatar in the civil world have also been told to protect themselves in place. So yeah, it was and was going to be the number one target for Iran to strike, and that's exactly what they've done. It does appear, however, to be the same number of missiles, according to Iran, that were dropped on their nuclear facilities. So they are trying to play a tit for tat game here, and maybe they hope that this is the last one.
It is interesting because, yeah, like you, I've served at Al Udeid. It's a very big base, over 100 military aircraft based there. The Combined Air Operations Centre is famously based there. 11,000 personnel are normally based there. But I do think what's telling on this particular one, I've just literally been doing a couple of very quick interviews, and everybody's looking at this saying this is an escalation. You're going, okay, let's take a couple of measured looks. First of all, as you say, it sounds like 14 missiles, the same as the US launched. Secondly, Qatar apparently was warned by the Iranians that there was incoming. Why would you do that if you wanted to inflict harm into the region? And also, Al Udeid is quite a remote airbase in the region. It's not right next to the built-up area, and therefore, whilst it will have put Qataris' nose out of joint, they'll be upset that their airspace has been violated. I do think if, and it's a big if, but if nobody is hurt on the ground, if no Americans are killed, this might create a bit of an opportunity for Iran to say to its internal public, look, we've struck back at America at the heart of their military capability in Iran. And it will also allow President Trump not to take the next step and escalate. So fingers crossed, that's where we sit at the moment.
Yeah, I think that is the rational conclusion that we would want to come to, that Iran sees this as a face-saving gesture and that America sees it as something that they can take on the chin because if it doesn't, as you say, cause any harm. I think where this goes horribly wrong, probably for America and Iran, is if there are casualties. And as you know, in America, one casualty is one casualty too many. And so this is going to be, hopefully things will calm down and this will settle into back to where we were a few hours ago. But if it doesn't, it's going to be very interesting to see what America does with the next move.
It's also interesting, though, I think it's a reflection on the media, because I don't know about you, but, you and I both do a fair bit of work in the media, and they do try and fan the flames of this. I was constantly barraged by, this is an escalation, what's Trump going to do, a point of, and you sort of go, hang on a minute, there is a little bit of face saving that goes on here. There is a little bit of, the Ayatollah will need to play a position of strength back to his people. He'll be playing back that actually he's struck at the heart of, American military might, whereas Trump needs to have an off-ramp as well. And I do think that all of the writing on the wall here is that by giving warning, by striking a base that's big, knowing it's well protected, it doesn't look, at least at first glance, anything has gone through. Whether this is the first of many attacks by Iran, that remains to be seen. But for now, I don't know about your thoughts, but it feels like the least worst option.
I'd agree. This was a conventional attack against a known target that the US has spent a lot of effort over the last few days making sure that there was nobody left out in the open. So, it's almost like both sides are going to shake hands across the table and go, all right, we'll step away if you step away. So, yes, Iran could have done a lot worse in all sorts of places that would have created all sorts of havoc, which clearly would have escalated. So, yeah, I wouldn't put this in the escalation camp. I'd put this in the counter punch, but a controlled punch that hopefully both sides can step back away from.
Also, that plays, I think, to the whole NATO angle as well. We're coming up on a series of meetings this week where, NATO are potentially going to announce 3.5%, 5% more spending. Everybody seems to have one agenda, and that's to placate President Trump. But actually, it does appear that Trump and America are operating more and more autonomously, less and less concerned about allies, because frankly they're the big gorilla in the room. And I do wonder what that means for our NATO first policy. What does that mean if the whole principle of NATO, if one person's attacked, everybody rushes to the rescue. At times like this, you wonder, did Trump even bat an eyelid that other nations might be a little bit embarrassed by him going in to Iran without engaging and just gone, no, we're the big superpower? I think that might have implications downstream for the trust that NATO colleagues have.
Yeah, all of that is applicable. I think whether Trump has had a honeymoon period or not is debatable. But if he did have one, it is definitely over now. This is proper politics and diplomacy. You can't bluff your way through this one. They have got involved. They have taken quite a serious act. There could be some serious repercussions. I'm not sure that Trump right now needs a fight with NATO or fall out in Europe. I think he now needs to think very carefully about how he stabilises the bits he needs to stabilise, and then think very hard about what might happen from this. I think if you look at the sums, America might struggle to get to 5% too. So maybe it's going to cause all of us some angst.
No, and the other bit, which we won't have time to get into properly now, but this is about non-proliferation agreements. Iran was a signatory. Without going through the history of it, back in 1970, there were some countries, 5, that already had nuclear weapons. So there was a 3-pillar strategy around the non-proliferation agreement, one of which was it was in everybody's interest not to proliferate, therefore your signatures. It was about decommissioning nuclear weapons for those partners that did have them, not seeing any progress with that. And it was also about the pursuit of peaceful use of nuclear power. But I think events over the last few years, particularly Ukraine's experience, that if they had nuclear weapons as they had, would that attack have happened? More and more countries are going to be going, we can only guarantee our security with nuclear weapons. North Korea was a signatory to the non-proliferation agreement until 2003 when they tested a weapon. So they've clearly been completely ignoring the non-proliferation bits. You've got Iran, who seems to be doing the same sort of thing. I wonder whether this is the start of a whole global look at where do we sit with nuclear energy and also with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, putting the nuclear genie back in the bottle is a tricky thing to do. And as many people will criticise Israel and America for what they've done over the last few days and weeks, is what do you do with a despot nation that clearly is hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapon against every rule of international law? Do you wait for them to get it and then deal with a nuclear equipped foe? Or do you take it out before it gets to that point? Because negotiation doesn't always work.